Welcome to Inspire Change, a new inspirational and motivational broadcast that strives to empower men in a positive way, designed to educate, empower, and inspire even the busiest individual on the go over that first cup of coffee. Please join me in welcoming Gunter, international psychologist, author, speaker, and producer.
Welcome everybody to another episode of Inspire Change. So over the last couple of episodes I've been talking about the impact of patriarchy on our behaviour. In the last episode I was talking about bullying, and the one before that I spoke also about the issue about domestic violence, and I connected the two in a very intricate and meaningful way, in that there is a continuum in this, whether we're talking about kids bullying each other in school, or a child being bullied by somebody else, or the issue about men bullying women and women bullying men in relationships, intimate relationships. But the problem goes further than that. It's actually something that we need to consider within the context of our society and what the cultural underlay is. Now, in my podcasts so far, I've kept referencing Philip Zimbardo's study on the Stanford prison experiment, but more importantly, the book that he wrote subsequently called The Lucifer Effect. And the reason why I'm connecting this together with Making Good Men Great is because his framework and my framework are actually, in my view, intricately intertwined. That is that, we have a tendency in our society, both scientifically but also culturally, philosophically, to look for what Zimbardo calls dispositional explanations for human behavior. That is, a disposition to be either good or bad, or in a particular mental state. Now, Zimbardo essentially points out that that's rather inadequate. That in order to truly understand why good people, good men, good women, do bad things, we need to understand two other factors. The first one is the situation. So it's about the sort of time and place and context that I find myself in that has a huge influence over how I behave, what it is that I do, either in regard to myself or towards somebody else or a group of people. Now, he talks about the dispositional being the bad apple. So we have somebody who's essentially bad. The bad barrel, that is the situation wherein a good person can actually start doing some bad things. And then really importantly, and this is never emphasized in my view enough, is the systemic, the bad barrel maker. Okay, so let's put that into a really strong context with this issue about bullying. Okay, so I want you to think about not just children, but also teenagers and adults. So if we take a child, a teenager or an adult, and we place them into the situation where there is some form of idea of difference included in the sort of group think, then we're already starting to have a very potentially problematic situation, unless it's checked. Now, let me backtrack a little bit. In 1987, I go back that far, I was listening to an interview done by Women's Own. I'm not sure if that publication still exists or not, with Margaret Thatcher. And she said something that really struck a chord with me. Not a good one either. She said that people essentially cast their problems at society. And there's no such thing as society, and I'm quoting her. There are individual men and women, and there are families. And no government can do anything except through people. And people must look after themselves first. It is our duty to look after ourselves. And then as an afterthought, she puts in, and then also to look after our neighbours. Now, unless you're really sort of critically reflective, at first that sounds pretty good. Yeah, we need to look after ourselves. We need to consider, the needs of oneself in the context of the needs of our family. But closer examination unpacks this as a seriously immoral proposition. And some people listening to this podcast might go, well, that's a little strong. And I'm going to explain why I think it is fundamentally immoral. She completely ignores the fact that human beings are not just a blank slate that comes into the world and then somehow out of the blue fits in. We know through developmental psychology, this is one of the things I talk about, is that we're socialized. And that socialization frequently depends on the sort of ideology that individual is embedded in. So if I'm in a culture that is patriarchal, I'm going to be socialized with patriarchal values and ideas and ideals, and I'm going to not really think about them. I'm just going to accept them for what they are. In a patriarchal society, fundamentally that means that inherently things are run by men, and women inherently do not have the same rights, the same position as men. And it's the normal order of things. Quite often, patriarchs try to explain this as a natural order. Look at, the animal kingdom where the males are dominant. And it's a very simplistic, and frequently uneducated explanation. So if you have a culture wherein a child grows up believing that status and competition are clearly primary values, then that will become a driving force in their behavior. Now, the other thing that happens with this is that those who are perceived to be not as competent, not as strong, will ultimately be discriminated against. Now, Zimbardo very quickly demonstrated how a group of randomly assigned college students, above average intelligence, with no mental health issues, well socialized, in the right situation, can go from good people caring for others to, if you're assigned a particular role, and in the prison experiments, if you were a guard, how quickly you can become abusive towards others, and that you will use your role, your position, as a power tool in lording it over somebody else. And yes, a lot of the guards in that experiment experienced what we call cognitive dissonance. That is, that their values in that situation clashed, and it caused them stress and anxiety, but not enough by the look of it to change their behavior. Another experiment that preceded the Zimbardo study on the prison experiment was Milgram, who basically instructed people to give the experimental subjects an electric shock. Now, they didn't actually do it, they just simply believed that they were doing it. There's lots and lots of studies throughout the 70s and 80s in social psychology that demonstrate these principles really well. One of the most famous ones was the brown eye versus blue eyes, where a teacher essentially tried to work out how to teach kids the meaning of brotherhood and tolerance. And so what she did was she arbitrarily designated one part of a class as superior to the other part, which was inferior, based on their eye color. Now, that's a really, interesting way of going, because there's no other variable here that suggests that there would be a natural difference between these kids. One of the things that she saw was virtually immediately the children with blue eyes would be the special superior ones, and the brown-eyed kids would be the inferior group. And the superior ones, the intelligent blue eyes, were given special privileges, while the inferior brown eyes had to obey certain rules. that enforced their second-class status, including, wearing a collar that enabled them to recognize their lowly status from a distance. And the interesting thing is, it didn't take long before this became abusive. For example, acting out, physically hitting someone because that child called him a brown eyes, which implied that he was like an inferior person, and in the context of that classroom, that he was like a Negro, an African American. So within a very short period of time, in fact, in one day, the brown-eyed children began to do very poorly on their schoolwork. They also became more depressed, sullen, and angry, withdrawn. And they began to describe themselves in derogatory terms like sad, bad, stupid, and mean. Now, how many of us have either seen this in action in the playground or at university, more likely less so at uni, but within the workplace where these things were more subtly played out? Some of us have even been on the receiving end. So the issue about whether this is, dispositional, whether I have this, capacity to be depressed or to be, sullen and angry, is only best described when we take the individual and we look at the situation that they're in and the roles and rules that exist around that person at the time. Now, in addition to these particular issues, one of the things that we need to consider when we look at and examine bullying of any kind is that bullying increases when we're able to operate in anonymity. And that means often within a group, within a crowd. If we look at what happened, in Germany during the Nazi era, people wore uniforms, they felt part of a group, they had a very strong group identity. Populism and nationalism promotes that exceedingly well. And, if we're talking about inspiring change, we need to think about which direction we're going to want to make that change go. Do we want change for the better, or are we going to allow ourselves to be led into a place that dehumanizes people and wherein we are able to act in a way that is completely immoral and harmful to others? So aside from de-individuation and anonymity, we also need to be very, very aware about the effects of dehumanization. And when I listen to various leaders, especially politically these days, one of the things that really, really scares me and also makes me angry is the way politicians create a binary us versus them platform wherein the them become lesser than. So if you happen to be of a particular ethnic group, a religious group, and you're not part of the accepted norm, the status quo, then obviously you're inherently bad. And that is extraordinarily destructive. So if we're going to really think about change for the better, we really do need to be alert to that whole issue about understanding the fabric, the nature of where bullying really comes from and how it's nurtured in very, very, very subtle ways. This is, it's only gotten explicit in the last probably 10 years, but it's been at work for a long time. And it's a seed that is very easily nurtured into a weed that takes over the garden that we live in. And we really do need to stop it. And one way of considering how to stop this is through understanding that as much as this can be done, that is, good people can be made to do bad things, we can also begin a process that reverses that, where people can be educated out of it. There are numerous people who are working in the area of taking radicalized individuals from groups and, in a sense, helping them to work through the process of that indoctrination and that ideological demand wherein the roles are harmful towards others and quite immoral. And it works. We can see it. I've seen, and read stuff about white supremacists who've recognized the problem of that particular ideology, and the light's gone on, and they've gone, I need to do something different. I need to be part of a better society. So coming back to Thatcher's, quote, there is the thing of society. There is the issue of the systems that we have. And often laws fall into that. Just because something's legal doesn't mean it's good. Lots of people do stuff legally, but it's actually quite immoral. And so if we're going to have a flourishing society wherein individuals thrive, we need to get on top of this. We need to begin to clearly examine our own values and our own behavior and what it is that we need to do individually within our social context, where we can stand up and speak out and go, no more. I'm not going to do this. And it was one of the interesting things that came out of the Stanford prison experiment as well, is this reluctance to simply submit on both sides. The guards submitted to the role that were given, and the prisoners submitted to their role in the given context. And it played out like a script, like a screenplay. There was no challenging it. There was no deeper reflection about that process. One of the things that Zimbardo talks about is that people, the prisoners never shared personal information with each other that would have allowed them to humanize again. They were dehumanized by the role that were given just as much as the guards were dehumanized by their role. And it was also a process of what Zimbardo calls de-individuation. That is that I'm no longer an individual. I am part of something through my uniform, through the equipment that I hold, through my, reflective sunglasses. All of that became critically important in maintaining the script. And in our society, we continue to play out the script of patriarchy, a very toxic and fundamentally flawed ideology that we're constantly subjected to, that creates harm, not just for men. I often say that patriarchy kills more men ultimately, but as men, we certainly do have really bad statistics when it comes to violence in intimate relationships, and we can't forget that. The men's movement is wrong. Yes, some women do harm men. They do kill men, but in a disproportionate way. Men far outweigh the statistics in that regard, and it's a really poor rationalization for maintaining bad behavior, fundamentally, in my book. And that's what, bullying and domestic violence is all about. This is why it's connected. It is fundamentally bad behavior. It's not a mental illness. It's not something that is inherent in the person. It's something that people have been socialized into. When we look at the backgrounds, for example, of serial killers, most of them have had an extremely deprived and poor environment that they grew up in. And, this is where, again, the relationship between the person, the context, and the system that we live in is fundamentally important. However, the beauty of the whole thing is that we have the capacity to think this through and to change things in the right direction, whether it's my individual behavior, my thoughts, my beliefs, my feelings, my actions towards others. It's there, and we can change how we live as a community. We need to respect each other as human beings, and it's not dependent on race, creed, colour, or religion. It is us as humanity. And on that note, until next time, thank you.
Thank you, Gunter, and thank you to our listeners. Inspire Change with Gunter Swoboda. Please join us every Wednesday for a new broadcast by visiting www.spreaker.com/show/inspire-change, which will feature all the ways you can listen. If you have comments or suggestions, email producer@studio3hollywood.net. Thank you and have an inspiring day.